Hey, what's up, Daywalkers and fellow travelers of the night? What you're about to watch is our first interview for the Seek at Night show. Obviously, we've done plenty on the Venom vlog and Parasite podcast, but this is our first one for Seek at Night, and it's with a Moon Knight writer and Venom writer, which is pretty awesome, kind of bridging our two worlds together. And this is Mike Chen, so I got to sit with him and talk with him about his new book, What If Marc Spector Was Host to Venom? It's a new novel out there right now. I highly recommend you guys picking up if you're a Marvel fan. We're going to talk about minor spoilers in this, but I did clip out one thing where I kind of spoil a part of the ending. I took that clip out. I'm going to make that a separate clip later. And then I'm also going to have a full review of this book in about a week or so. And so what we're going to do is a giveaway. I want to promote this book. I want people to read it. It's really, really good, especially comic book fans. I think you guys will like it. So to someone in the comments, if you leave a comment on this video, and I'll like all the comments, I'll try to engage with everybody, but I will pick a comment at random. If you live in the US, I will send you a copy, a physical copy of the book. Or if you're international and you can get a Kindle version, I can do that too. So I will send it from Amazon, and we will get that book to you so you can check it out for yourself. And then for everyone else who maybe can't participate in this, I do have 2 digital giveaways that I will give out in this episode. So keep an eye out. There will be 2 points where there will be a digital comic book code for a Moon Knight comic book that will pop up on screen. So the first person to put those codes in will get it. So keep an eye out. If you're on here and you follow me on Instagram or anything like that, I'll give you my email. That's listed down below, theparasitepodcast@gmail.com. So if I pick you as a winner, make sure that's how you contact me, and we'll figure it out and we'll get a book to you for sure. So please sit back, enjoy this interview. Mike, thanks again for being here. I had a blast talking with you, and enjoy the show, guys. Hey, what's up, Daywalkers and fellow travelers of the night? We are here with our first interview on the Seek at Night show, and we have Mike Chen, who is the writer of a new book that you need to go get right now. It is called What If Marc Spector Was Host to Venom? And this is a really cool young adult novel, would you call it, Mike?
No, I would say it's like, it's published by the adult science fiction imprint of Penguin Random House. But I think like from a story perspective, I think it's okay for readers from like 13 up.
Perfect. Yeah, and I felt the same way when I was reading it. I was like, I think I was under the assumption because of the Scarlet Witch Peter Parker one that I was like,
Mhm.
oh, this might be for younger readers. But even that had some moments in it where I was like, this does feel more adult. And then with the themes you discuss in this, especially with DID and everything, uh,
Mhm.
you really did a great job. And so I want to first off just say that everyone watching, like, I love this book. It's amazing. Not only did I love it, but one of my alters, Blue, also read it and loved it as well. And we are just enamored with the take you had on these characters. So I can't wait to discuss this with you. So again, thanks for being here today. And yeah, anyone out there, please, check out our giveaway, but also go buy this yourself if if you prefer. We would love that. I would love to talk to more people about this book and see more people talking about it, as I'm sure Mike would.
Yeah. Please give me royalties.
Yes, awesome. Well, I do want to dive into some questions because I have some things that I always preface questions with. So
Mhm.
the first one with I do want to talk about some of your previous work because before we recorded, you had mentioned like Star Trek and Star Wars. So
Mhm.
you've written great titles. Like I've actually went and checked out some of the other stuff, like A Beginning at the End and Vampire Weekend
Mhm.
and Star Wars Brotherhood, which I didn't even know existed, and I end up really loving the Anakin and Obi-Wan characterizations in that
Oh,
book. I mean,
great. Thank you.
you did an amazing job with those 2 characters. So that just made me more excited to read this. So
Mhm.
how did you end up in the Marvel Universe now and writing characters like Venom and Moon Knight?
So um y- the way that people always ask like how do you get to write for your favorite IPs. um and so the trick is to have an established original catalog first. And so when I signed with my agent, we talked about like what are the what type of IP work would I be interested in. And so I kind of named off like my favorite things. And so what he does as he does his job and talks to various editorial teams, there the at the major imprints, like the editors, like they do a whole cross section of stuff. And so the editorial team that does Star Wars also does like the adult Marvel tie-ins. And so they already knew my work from Star Wars, and so when they were looking at this particular book, or actually this particular series, actually it was about a year before I started with Venom and Moon Knight. They let my agent know that the series was coming up, and they weren't quite sure. I think they were projecting either 5 or 7 books, but they weren't totally sure yet. They were just kind of like, would Mike be interested in joining us if we're going forward with it? And I looked at my schedule at the time and I said, Yes, this sounds cool. Like, what if is always lots of fun. Um, but I couldn't do it for at least a year. And so my agent called me after they announced, I think it was after they announced the Loki book. And my agent called me and they said, "Do you want to do book 3?" And it was working with my schedule, so I said, like, "Okay, well, who's involved with it?" And he goes, "It's Moon Knight." And I'm like, "Oh, that's cool." And he said, and was like, he goes, "Get this, Moon Knight's going to join with Venom." And my mind just kind of exploded, and I was like, "How has no one ever done this before?"
Sure.
Um, and so I said, "Yes, yes, absolutely." Like, I don't even care like what they want the parameters of the story to be. The concept of Moon Knight and Venom, in a body is just way too cool to pass up. So that's basically how it happened. Like, it's just they knew my body of work,
Mhm.
and that's how they brought me into Star Wars. And they knew from Star Wars that I can work within kind of like the rules of IP, and I'm fast and not difficult to work with, which is really,
That's
really
key.
important. Yeah, when you have tight deadlines,
Yeah.
and that's how it came to be.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm also a big Resident Evil fan, and we talk about those movies a lot. And people will say, like, "How did they make 6 of those movies?" I go, "Because Paul W. Sanderson is easy to work with. He always comes in under budget. He's on time, and he's got a cool wife who does great action scenes. So,
Yeah.
like, it's pretty like, why wouldn't you hire the guy?"
In the creative world, if you could be a nice person with good ideas and you're flexible and can adapt to stuff, you will go just so much farther
Yeah,
because people will like to work with you.
yeah, of course. Yeah, because you're kind of freelancing it, but but you make these connections, and like you said, you because of something you did on Star Wars that opened a door to the
Mhm,
Marvel side, and that's awesome. I mean, I'm glad you ended up here because I think of I follow writers and novelists too, and I've written a couple self-published novels, and I like to follow people and see where they go in their career. And I'm really, especially after reading that Star Wars book, I'm so glad you're the one who wrote this story.
no,
So
thank you.
you're welcome. So I want to get into how you start this book because
Mhm,
so on a personal level, like there's a lot of things in this book that resonated with us, obviously as a system, but at the start of this book, you have these transcripts from a mental health facility
mhm,
called Retrograde Sanitarium. And
yeah,
Mark is talking with a Dr. Emmett, and he's
mhm,
talking about his friends like Gina, Crowley, Marlene, and
mhm,
Frenchie. And he's also, you're establishing kind of like Mark as a character,
right, yeah.
and because this is a what if universe, it's another universe. So you're showing what's similar maybe to the comic book version, what's different. So you're kind of setting this tone, which I really love. So when writing a less compassionate kind of evil doctor character like Dr.
Yeah.
Emmett, what is important to establish when you first meet them, like you do in this book, for the reader and the audience to know that this might be a person who actually doesn't care about their patients?
So Dr. Emmett, she actually doesn't have an established first name. She's from the 2016 Moon Knight run,
Yeah,
and she's pretty evil in that.
in
And she
that run.
moves on to she's in bits and pieces of further Moon Knight stuff, but the 2016 run, like a lot of it takes place at Retrograde Sanitarium. And so one of the main pieces when I was first plotting this out and trying to pick out the biggest parameter from the editorial team is that this is not MCU,
Right.
but I had flexibility to pick from basically any point of comic continuity. So it made sense. Like the 2016 Moon Knight run is like kind of the modern era, like the kind of like the cornerstone of it. So
Right.
it made sense to really just take that as kind of like a starting point, and then throw Venom in.
Right. Toss him in.
Yeah. So with Dr. Emmett, we talked about different ways to use some sort of prologue to kind of like, because there's going to be people who like maybe have watched the Moon Knight show, or maybe they're just continuing from reading the first two books,
Mhm.
and they may not know as much about Moon Knight. So we had to there had to be some sort of introduction and primer, um, and I suggested using a transcript, because with the transcript it's just dialogue and you don't need to have like prose in there to
Right.
slow things down. So even though it goes for like 3 or 4 pages, it doesn't feel like pages. It goes reads way faster. So we kind of bullet pointed like what are the points we need to get across. Like we have to establish basically who Mark is, who the alters are.
Mhm.
Does anyone believe him?
Right.
What is like the situation with Khonshu, and like basically what's his history, both with his military career and also with his mental health. And also to establish that Dr. Emmett is not a good person.
Right.
So it was really just trying to get all of those pieces together into a really short time span. Um, so that the reader, because like if you are completely new to Moon Knight and Venom, like I could see this being like very confusing, because there's there's a lot going on that's not exactly straightforward. So the idea was to try to establish that information as quickly as possible and as clearly as possible. And so I took the characterization of Dr. Emmett from the 2016 run, and I decided pretty early on, like I'm not going to try to humanize her. Like there's a little bit of I are we okay with like minor spoilers?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to have a review with spoilers dropping soon after this interview too. So
Okay.
absolutely, you can talk about minor spoilers in here.
So there's a scene, or there are several scenes inside Emmett's office,
Mhm.
and the only thing that I tried to do was give her more dimension as a human. So when Stephen and Jake are looking around her office, they see bits and pieces of like she's got a mug from like her university. She's got
Right.
like a diploma on her wall. You know, she's got ties to like some other Marvel villain in places, like
Yeah,
just through knickknacks. And
Ravencroft
that
and stuff.
yes,
Yeah,
exactly. And so it was to establish that she's got a history, but in terms of like trying to make her more sympathetic, it's like I don't have time to go there. Like that could
yeah,
be for something else. So it
sure.
was like uh, it was nice to give her some dimension as a person because it makes her feel much more tangible, but
Right,
also like she's clearly a villain, and like and she's not the main villain, so like let's just
right.
get her in there, serve her purpose, and get her out.
Yeah, and that's fair. I mean, like I tell people that too, like in writing and but also in reading. Like
Mhm.
sometimes people are just bad people,
Yeah,
and there's but that
and in
doesn't
real
mean
life.
yeah, yeah, of course, in real life, and you can yes, you can add elements to them that round them out as evil, but they're still just what they are.
Yeah.
So, but I like that, and I because I always think like, especially after watching the Moon Knight show, where they had that really great interaction with Ethan Hawke and
Mhm.
Oscar Isaac in the room, and you're wondering if Ethan is actually a part of Mark's mind trying to help him, or if it's actually Dr. Harrow,
Yeah.
doing evil. And what I liked about this was that it was just like it's straightforward because you like you said, not only do you have to get introduce these characters and kind of a basic understanding for people who might not know, but you're also mentioning stuff like DID, which is a concept that people have seen versions of in movies but still do not understand.
Yeah.
And as someone who when I was diagnosed, I had no idea that for years before that I was part of a system. I had no idea.
Mhm.
And I remember watching Moon Knight and going like, how could he not know? But really I was asking, how could I not know? And that's the complexities of this, diagnosis. So
Mhm.
to even squeeze some of that into your intro, I thought was, I mean, you did a great job.
Oh, thank you.
You're,
It went through several iterations
I'm
to try
sure,
to make it as both like straightforward and complete as possible.
right, yeah, and coherent, which it was. I was like,
Mhm.
I could, and I think keeping it to dialogue, I think that was a smart move, for
Mhm.
sure. Well, we're also like I've done almost 900 episodes of the Venom vlog. I'm a big Venom and symbiote fan, for
Mhm.
sure. Know a lot about the lore. We've gone through all 35 plus years of the character's history on the show. So this and I love that you are the journey you have the symbiote go on in this book.
Mhm.
He begins a bit focused, like the symbiote can be sometimes, where it's maybe even slightly misguided in his approach to what's right and wrong and everything.
Yeah.
uh, and I like that you kept that true to that, to the symbiote, and you treated the symbiote as a character. A lot of times we will see comics where the symbiote is just there to make Eddie stronger, but
Right.
I always like him, or the suit, as an entity and a thinking living creature, because it is one. So what you've done with it and having it bond with Mark, and then by the end of the book kind of show more of those heroic traits that the symbiote has learned from Eddie and other hosts in the past, like
Mhm.
Peter and stuff. And you even mentioned those guys in the book. So seeing everything come together, like, were there any particular Venom comics that you pulled from or got inspiration from that readers and audiences, we can tell them about, that might have helped you create this take on the character?
I kind of I would say like I'm like a casual Venom fan. So I grew up in the I was born in the late 70s, so I grew up with comics in like the late 80s and like the 90s. Like that was like my peak Marvel era. And I remember in middle school the first time Venom arrived, and like
Mm,
everyone was talking about like, have you seen Spider-Man has a black suit? And like everyone was just talking about that. And because comics were like only in print and
mm,
based on like whether your comic book store stocked it, and anything to do with Venom like sold out so fast. And so I remember just like being totally fascinated with like the fact that like Peter Parker was like driven to do some like un-Peter Parker stuff, and over probably like a year or so of just like playground discussions, like and also as like the character himself like starts to evolve,
mhm.
um, like my introduction to Venom was very much like Venom's on a chaotic mission, um, and so I thought if you're introducing Venom to Marc Spector, who has like no prior history, and you also know that Venom is being guided by like some sort of external factor here, it would make sense that it's like Venom's going to have an arc.
Mhm.
Uh, and so things are going to start off as like mission focused and chaotic. And the beauty of the story, I think, I often talk about how the biggest theme of the book is like unlikely friendships.
Right.
And because of the logistics of the book, like very minor spoiler, but I like it's in the back cover description, so I don't think it's really a
Okay.
spoiler. Um, but in order to actually tell a narrative with so many voices, we basically split them off into two bodies,
Right.
using the multiverse. So one body has Steven, Jake, and Khonshu,
Mhm.
and one body has Mark and Venom. And so it's a story of unlikely friendships because Steven and Jake like don't really get along, but they
Right.
have to work together without Mark to kind of, act as like the mediator between them. And then you have Mark and Venom, Mark who is trying to understand what is life without Steven and Jake. And also like why is this alien yelling at me in my head? Um,
Right.
and there are some very clear turning points between these relationships where they start to trust each other and they explicitly talk about what constitutes trust between personalities.
Mhm.
And I wanted to kind of show that where Venom, this isn't like Venom meeting Eddie for the first time.
Right.
This is like Venom comes with a history and it's talked about, and Mark kind of gives him shit about it, which was really fun to write. Um, but it's about two people who are kind of like in their prime, learning to trust each other and learning to say like, hey, it's we thought we wanted different things, but we actually want the same thing. So let's work together and let's trust each other. So like that was kind of like a very intentional arc with Venom to like start out at a place where Venom feels like there are these things threatening the hive mind, and the only way through it is if I just do this job as fast as possible. And then Mark is like, wait, slow down. There's more at stake here. Let's work together. And for them to kind of come together, and then also to start becoming like teammates with the other body is it was like a very meticulously planned arc for all of them.
I bet, and we'll talk about some of that in the next question I have. Because, but real quick on that front, like that moment where, at least for me, when I felt like they were having that interaction, the symbiote and Mark, it was like Venom started piecing together or connecting the dots where like Mark was saying, well, I kind of need Jake and Steven and Khonshu in a way. And Venom's like, oh, that's your hive,
Yeah.
and he's like, oh, so oh, I see. So you're protecting your hive,
Hmm.
and my goal is to protect my hive. I kind of like that whole scene, the way that played out. And then Venom, who is a being that can see into other universes, to an extent, and have these connections and spread out and is attached to the cosmos, have this like, simple moment of
Right.
understanding. I love how I mean, I'm going to gush about it a lot, how you're writing this,
That's okay.
but I love how that was done. It was very well executed. And there's moments in this book where I found myself going, man, I had a similar understanding moment when things were being explained to me. And
Mhm.
it just, so I don't know if you talked to anyone who was, part of a system or anything while writing this, or what research you did, but there was so much in here that I was like, God, that is almost a one-to-one comparison to something that I've been through, or a moment that I took to understand something. So I don't know if that was the case, but I mean, it felt very real on the page to me.
I actually did not have a lot of time to do research.
Figured.
Most of my research was actually like getting into like the nitty gritty of like reading and rereading and rereading like specific runs of the characters. There was a consultant though, from the editorial team that kind of like went over all the DID stuff in the manuscript,
Okay.
and so like I fortunately didn't actually have to change too much. Like they actually said like, this is pretty spot on. So I think like probably most kudos to the Moon Knight TV show for like, kind of establishing the groundwork from what I could work with. And then when I was treating the relationships in there, I mean like I think it was about like making sure that all of the personalities like respected each other, respected
Mhm.
like the circumstance that they were in, and it could never come down to like mockery or being a joke or being like body horror or something, because I think like
Right.
that's how DID is often represented
Most of
in
the time. Yeah.
yeah, and it's like I don't want to do that. Like, like I want to, I want all these characters to feel respected, and they just live in a circumstance that is not typical for most people. And so using that approach um, kind of creates like this baseline of sensitivity.
Mhm.
And so it's like the conversations where Steven and Jake are joking about like who gets to control the body,
Yeah.
that's more of like, two brothers fighting over like the car
Who
type
drives
of
the
thing.
car? A
Yeah,
hundred
exactly.
percent. That's how it is with us. A
Yeah.
100%. Yeah, I mean, like, speaking of the Moon Knight show, I mean, we're big fans of that too, and the performances in that show. But the fact that show starts with you following an altar,
Mhm.
like most people who don't understand this diagnosis will say, "Oh, well, altars they're just made up; they're not real." But we're very real people in the sense that we're just as fleshed out as anyone else. We're not set in one emotion or anything. We may have a device that we have to be protective of, or a goal or something, a mission we do in the system, or a role we play to an extent, but we're still, you know, deeper than the surface.
Right.
And I like that you handled that in this, and I love that the show followed, an altar, and made you care about the altar,
Yeah.
as much as you cared about Mark when you started learning about him. So I'm glad that was a blueprint. I'm glad you had the person who went through the book and checked everything. And I'm glad you went with your gut on that, because it was the right move. There was so much stuff in this, especially like there's two systems, like you said, in this book. So a
Mhm.
system, for those who don't know, is what we're called essentially. It's a label in a way, but no other way to say it. We're a system of identities, and there are two in this because of the multiverse. So you have the one Mark that has Steven and Jake and Khonshu in this universe, and then you have
Mhm.
another from another universe that is pretty much like Jake, Conchu, and Steven, and they bring Venom with them. So I don't want to get too much into more spoilers than that, but having all of those personalities, all those
Yeah.
voices, and all in two different heads. My question is, how many bottles of Tylenol did you have to ingest when writing this book?
One of the very smart suggestions from my editor, Gabby Munoz.
Mhm.
She said, because I kept on writing like this Mark and that Mark, and she's
Yeah,
like, no, just call one Spector. Like one of them is
smart.
Spector, one of them is Mark.
Yeah.
Like, and that immediately like differentiated things. And after I did that, I remember she made a note where she's like, you should have them actually talk about this in the book so that it doesn't seem just as like a framing device. It's like it's them being like, wow, this is confusing. Okay, like our guy is Spectre. Okay, let's go.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So that like by having them actually talk about it makes it easier for the reader to grasp that on instead of saying like the other Mark constantly. Because but there was I have when I plot things out for all of my books, and in this case, like I had a spreadsheet, and like I think I called them like Mark Prime and other Mark,
Okay.
when I was like trying to describe things out. So it was it's funny because I think like if you look at the narrative, and like, if you treated everyone as kind of like their own characters, the narrative is actually pretty straightforward. It's like, if you
Right.
treat them as like Mission Impossible style teams instead of like people with DID, or like, joining with the symbiote, it actually is pretty straightforward, because it's like your team is like, here's the planner, here's the muscle, here's like the
The
Egyptian
wild
god
card.
who's
Yeah.
overseeing them. Yeah. And they're going towards this MacGuffin of this device, which, for longtime Moon Knight fans who have not read the book yet, it is a very deep Easter egg
It
in
sure
some
is. The
90s
siphon.
Moon Knight. Yeah,
Yeah.
and that I will say, like, I didn't come up with that. Like, I had asked, and when I was plotting this out,
Mhm.
I actually used a placeholder, and I just said like MacGuffin, and I asked my editorial team, I
Yeah.
said, like, "Can you ask the Marvel lore team?" I said, like, "The MacGuffin, like, it has to be a device of some
Mhm.
sort. It has to connect to, like, the multiverse, in some way, and it has to be something that can be, like, powered up and destroyed." And so I'm like, give me some suggestions. And they took like about a week, and there's like several people who work on the internal lore team at Marvel, and they sent over this list. And then so when I saw the siphon, I was like, it's that. It has to be that.
Yeah.
And they
The
sent
name
me,
alone.
yeah, they sent me the PDFs of, like, it's only 2 issues in like the
Yeah.
90s, like Mark Spector Moon Knight run, and it's like the most ridiculous device. Like it really is. But like it fit perfectly for this. So we built a whole story about it. But in terms of like outlining, it's basically like this team of protagonists, they're kind of at odds. They're both competing for this MacGuffin. And then they discover there's like a third external force against them. And so, like, from that perspective, if you actually map it out, it's actually really, really straightforward. It's like they're competing, they get to the middle with the MacGuffin, and
Right.
then they decide like we actually have to team up. Um, and it's like it's a pretty common plot that you'll see in a lot of thrillers and action movies. It just gets really complicated when they're only occupying one body on each side. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think you're right. I think by writing it as a team book,
Hmm.
essentially, um, with maybe like you said, just two vehicles as opposed to like 6 vehicles or what 7. But like you it paces really well because you are taking big concepts, not just big super comic booky fictional concepts, but you're also, like you said, trying to have a tenderness and respect to the diagnosis of DID, and then also adding an alien onto it.
Yeah.
So there, yeah, there's all these things, but I like that you handled it like a team book, and I like that you have these two team members that don't really get along normally, and they have to learn to work together, and it's got all those tropes, sure, but the difference is that it's like you said, it's in one body or two bodies in this case,
Yeah.
and it's like, yeah, this is, I think that's good for readers who have to wrap their head around certain concepts, is that okay, this is familiar, so I can understand this,
I
and
I am a big fan of like like when it's done well, like buddy cop comedy type thing. Like,
Yeah.
and like my favorite actual movie in the MCU is Captain Marvel, because I love it's Carol and Nick Fury in a buddy comedy.
Yeah.
You know, you could take all of the other stuff about like the Skrulls and put that aside. It's just Nick and Carol like giving each other shit, and I
Yeah.
love that. And I am also a huge fan of the Mission Impossible TV show, not so
Okay.
much like the you know the movies, because the movies are basically just stunt pieces, but I love team based stealth.
Yeah.
And so like when I was plotting this out, like if you think about like the like kind of the middle act where they have like various break-ins
Hmm.
that they have to do, it's very much Mission Impossible, where there's a plan, there's each person with each specialty, and they have to coordinate with each other, and something goes wrong and someone has to step up. And so that's kind of how I viewed plotting this out, especially like the set pieces.
That's awesome. Well, if you ever, speaking of stealth and espionage, hopefully you get to write something for Metal Gear Solid one day, because I'm a big fan of that too.
I can just talk about Metal Gear for hours.
I'll try to, maybe in another time I'll have you back on. We can just nerd out on that for sure.
I don't think like they don't have any, like they have adaptations.
They made adaptations of 2 of the games, I believe.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
but there's no real like. I mean, I mean, this is a huge tangent, but like I wouldn't touch any. I would not want to be involved with any sort of like Metal Gear like original storytelling that did not involve Hideo Kojima, because it's
Yeah,
his baby.
for sure.
So, but like, but as a standalone like franchise, it's one of my favorite things in the universe.
Mine too. And I'll go off a little tangent here too, real quick. In 2010, on top of our diagnosis, we had a brain aneurysm rupture,
Mhm.
and our original host has since not waken up, and I was the one who emerged on the other side of that aneurysm when our body was still functioning,
Mhm.
and I woke up in a hospital. I had bandages on my head. I was, scared. I didn't really know anything was going on. And I remember playing a couple years later, when I was after finished physical therapy and speech therapy, and I was walking and talking again. Metal Gear Solid 5 came out,
Mhm.
and I played that. And the opening is someone who wakes up, bandages on their head, can't walk, can't talk. They're in a hospital, and I was so enamored about how one to one I connected with that, and I started crying. I was on stream. I was streaming the game, and I was crying my eyes out. And then we get to the end, and I don't, spoilers for Metal Gear 5, I guess, but you find out who this Snake is that you're playing as,
Yeah.
and even more so now that I know our diagnosis. Going back and thinking about that, I always wonder if some part of me subconsciously knew, because that's essentially, in a way, what happened, where I feel like I woke up in someone else's body.
Yeah.
And I was like, this. So Metal Gear for me, 100%. I got the Master Collection, and yeah, I love those games. They're amazing. So I hope, I'm gonna keep an eye out for your name on one of those books. I would love to see you do that as like a series. But you would need more Tylenol, I think. Do you have some cool cameos in this book, by the
Oh
way?
yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Dr. Ashley Kafka, who we're big fans of as symbiote and Venom people, but you had a T-Rex Moon Knight you squeezed in there.
Yes.
You mentioned Eddie Brock.
Dino Knight.
Yeah, Dino Knight. That's it. Yeah, you had some cool stuff. Was there anything in here that was meant something to you, or something that like you just love that you got to put in? A couple things even, or something you wanted to put in and didn't make it, if you're allowed to say that? Like, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, so I'm gonna put up like spoiler wall
Okay.
here.
Okay.
So everyone just like tune out for a few minutes if you haven't read the book yet. When I first started this, they said like, this is not MCU. You can't pull anything from the MCU.
Right.
And then I was like, what about Layla? Because Layla is awesome.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, so they went back and they talked about it, and they said, well, Layla is a comic character now. So as long as you reference Layla's comic story,
Yeah.
then yes, you can have her. And I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna write her in, and like, I'm not gonna let anyone, I'm saving this email that says I could use her.
Right.
And so in the middle of the book, there is this big auction and gala. It's kind of like a villains like gathering of stuff. And so when we were first talking about this, I was like, oh, this is a place where you can have a lot of fun cameos. And so they're like, just, if you want to just describe people, just go for it. And so it's like when when Steven and Jake are like trying to come in, and it's like they see Emma Frost, like no one's named. Like
Right.
I just try to describe them. And so my friend Kamal, who
Mhm.
is actually he gets a cameo. He is the biggest Marvel fan that I know, and he's like, this book is in his queue. He's finishing up something else, so I think when he gets to that part, he's gonna freak out.
Yeah.
But I asked him, like, is there anyone that you would like cameoed in here? And he suggested Random, which was a character that I don't actually
Oh.
know. And so I looked him up. I'm like, okay, I can describe him. Like, I'm
With the
throwing
big
him in there.
arm. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
But then I was like, when they said you could use Layla, I'm like, I don't want to just have Layla walking by in the background. I want Layla to like mean something, because she means something to people who were introduced to Moon Knight through the
The
show.
show. Yeah.
And so I try to give her like a really important, like, everything would fall apart if it wasn't for Layla, like, moment. And so she gets a few chapters, and that was really, really special. And I like, so this will show my age, because I'm in my mid 40s. And in the 90s, I watched a lot of independent film, and that was that was my introduction to Ethan Hawke. And so Ethan Hawke, who plays Harrow in the Moon Knight TV show, so in like, no single reader has got this so far. Like, I can't believe no one has got this, or at least no one's told me about that they
Yeah.
caught it. But so in the book,
Mhm.
when Layla and Stephen and Jake, when they part ways, Layla says that basically that she's hunting down Harrow, who's going to be at this gala, and she says, I have to catch him before sunrise. And before sunrise is there is a trio of Ethan Hawke movies, is like Before Sunrise, After Sunset, and I forget
Yeah.
yeah. No one
Wow.
has got that. I pointed out
No.
to my editorial team, and they're
That's
like, yeah, we're too young for that. I'm like, damn it. Like,
I'm
no one got that.
I'd probably be the right age for that if I didn't start existing 14 years ago. But
Yeah.
but I have seen a lot of Ethan Hawke stuff. I'm a huge fan of his. But when you say that, those dots connected, I'm like, holy cow, that's awesome. That's a
That's
cool
just
little reference.
I just put that in there for me, because
Yeah,
like, like, I used to rent, like, indie movie VHSs, like, by myself on like Friday nights, and so, like, but yeah, no one's got that so far. So
dude.
um hopefully someone watching this is a big Ethan Hawke fan and goes, yes, that's cool.
They're like, yeah, I did get that.
Yeah.
Comment below if you got that. Yeah, that's awesome. That's a cool. I like little things like that though. And like you said, you're like, it's kind of for me, but there's another you out there. I promise. They'll read this
Yeah.
book and they'll catch it too. Well, we've talked about how you did the research you've done and the stuff for DID and OSDD, which is what we originally diagnosed with before getting the full DID diagnosis. So, like you talking about the comic runs you pulled from and all this, you have did you have a favorite alter to write when you were diving into these characters? Because again, for me, and this isn't a me connection, but we have a guy who I would put on the level of Jake Lockley, maybe. Not a one-to-one comparison, but we call him Purple. We all go by colors. And he's kind of the one that can be standoffish his at times with us, and hard to communicate with. And I could see Blue and Purple being stuck in a body and having to work together. And that's what I got from reading this, is like, oh, this feels like those two, the way they kind of go back and forth. But you give Jake like such a big moment, and you give Steven, you give these guys really awesome heart, like you said, you treated them like people, which I really appreciate. So I was just curious, like, did you have a favorite alter or moment with an alter that you had writing? I know we might get into some spoilers here, and did any of them take more time to like get their voice down, like when you're writing them and mapping them out? Were you like, I'm struggling a little bit with this guy, or did that, because you planned it out as a team-based thing, did that not really happen?
I think, like, so all credit to Oscar Isaac, When I write very heavily. Like voice is the first thing that I do. It's like my natural strength as a writer. Um, and when they said no MCU with this, I said like, well, Comic Steven is kind of boring. Comic Steven is a billionaire who is kind of like Bruce Wayne,
True.
or Oliver Queen, and like it's kind of like a thing that's been done. MCU Steven is just brilliant. And it's all in like the performance in the voice and the neuroticism. And so when they said like you can't use MCU Steven, I said like, can I take MCU Steven's personality and voice, like the performance by Oscar Isaac, and graft that onto the standard Stephen Grant backstory? And they said that's fine. This is the multiverse. You can do that.
Okay.
And so for me, it was like writing Stephen, like my editor, like the first words that you get out of so Stephen's chapters are in first person, and that
Right.
was really
Which I
intentional
love. I love that.
because he's got a much stronger like inner monologue
Mhm.
than Jake or Mark. And so the first words that you get from Steven's perspective is ow, 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 ow. And like I hear that in my head as Oscar Isaac's like Stephen Grant, like
Right.
just imagining him like waking up in a burning building and he's just like freaking out. So that was really fun. I mean, then taking Jake, kind of taking like the gruffer characters that Oscar Isaac has played. So this is not Poe Dameron, who's charming, and this is different from his perspective of or his characterization of Marc Spector. I've just tried to think of like different Oscar Isaac performances and like grab their voice. And so that's kind of where Jake's voice comes from. And it was like it's really important to me. So sometimes in some of the comic runs, Jake is just portrayed as like this very brutal fist. And
Yes.
I wanted him to like, yes, that's very important, but I
Mhm.
wanted, because we are getting into Jake's head, I
Right. He's
wanted
not only that. Right.
yeah, like
Right.
there's a purpose, and
Right.
like Jake has to have a heart of gold if he's able to build up his network of informants, which is
Mhm.
like the homeless community in New York. And like so in order to do that, people have to trust him. And so for him to build that trust, like he's got to be good to them, and he's got to have some sort of like there has to be a magnanimous drive to do that. And so there's a really good conversation between them, which to me like um I think like I wanted to make like kind of like a cultural point with this, where Steven's talking about like things don't work that way because Steven sits in boardrooms. Steven thinks like
Mhm.
very high level, and then
Right.
Jake's like, that may work for you, but like I work in the community
Right.
itself, and like yes, you're right, but also you guys are making decisions that do not affect us down here on the street level. And I think that's like a bigger argument for society right now. Like how do you consolidate those two perspectives?
Mhm.
Because they're both right in a way,
Yeah.
and you need to get that overlap. And so that was like having the anytime like those conversations came out between those two, it was just really fun. um the conversations between Mark and Venom about Eddie were just so much fun to write. um
Yes.
and but my favorite exchange between all of them is when Steven, and like I can hear this in Oscar Isaac's
And
voice,
yeah.
where Steven, when Steven understands like the transfer of powers, and he says, "Oh, you're like escrow for superpowers," and then Jake just goes, "No one cares, Steven," and like I hear that as Oscar Isaac yelling that in like a
Yeah.
gruff tone, and
Yeah.
then later it's referenced again, and then Venom says like, "We do not understand escrow," and my
Yes.
my editor. My editor put a little note in the manuscript where she put, "Me too, Venom. Me too."
Yeah, I love that line that when it came back towards the end, because I mean, yeah, you have a lot of things happening because you're also tying into the bigger picture of these what if books, with
Mhm.
like the villain, who will keep a secret for now since we did a good job so far, and American Chavez, and like
Mhm.
where her role is, and I really like this, and then that conversation she has with the symbiote is awesome. So last question,
Mhm.
but I do want to mention, you mentioned your wife here. I really loved the acknowledgments at the end and how you and her sat and watched the Moon Knight show and had discussions about it. I just want to say that We do too. Actually, I wasn't the first one to watch the Moon Knight show. Blue was, and Blue is the one who was like, "You're struggling with this news, this diagnosis. You're fighting us. Please, you like to sit, you like to watch TV, you like the MCU. Watch this show."
Mhm.
And I didn't watch it until the 5th episode was about to air, so I was able to binge most of
Mhm.
it. And man, that 5th episode was something else for us. And I remember being like, okay, well, I'm ready to hug now. Like, that Steven and Mark moment, I was like, I'm ready for that now, like to
Mhm.
start that process. And it's still, I mean, 2.5 years later, I'm still learning, and I'm still, this, it's not a, like you said, it's like a limb. It's like you don't just adjust right away.
Yeah.
So our whole life has changed. I mean, it's been a lot. So I love that moment though, where you're talking about you and your wife discussing these things, and I love hearing about that with the representation. This is the first time I feel I've actually really, besides that Metal Gear moment, which is pure fantasy, and so is this, but just felt like, oh wow, it's interesting to see someone who kind of understands me going through something, even if it is a fictional character, because
Yeah.
it's a small percentage of people in the real world who I can talk to about this,
Well,
who
that's the
who
power
understand.
I think of, like, especially genre fiction,
Mm.
and like how superheroes have gotten like so woven into the mainstream is that like one of my favorite things, like I don't know if you watched DC's Legends of Tomorrow. It's like
100%.
one of my favorite freaking shows of all time. And there's a moment where where like there's Muslim characters on there,
Hmm.
and we have seen so many times in media Muslim characters are always like either just like hyper religious, like
Hmm.
academics, or they're terrorists.
Right.
And it's like, no, they're just like you know chilling out on the ship, and like
Yeah.
eating donuts and playing video games. And it's like they'll talk about like you catch glimpses of them like practicing their religion, but
Mhm.
it's just in the background, and like that sort of like space to exist, I
Yeah.
think is really really important. As someone who, like, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and during that time, Asian characters on TV were usually just martial artists.
Yeah.
Y-
Yeah.
and it's like, you know, I I write I write my Asian leads as kind of disasters, because I want the space for Asian kids to be disasters,
Okay.
uh, to be like punk rock loser vampires who like are not doctors or engineers or something like that.
Yeah.
And so I think like art really provides us like the space to breathe, and allow these different representations to exist. And it helps not just the people who identify with it, but for the people who are experiencing outside of that stereotype for the first time.
Yeah.
It normalizes them, and that normalization is so important. So that's my spiel on that.
Yeah. I agree, and I think normalization, and just that we're all much have a lot more in common than we think sometimes,
Yeah,
and then that your life, just because you're not this one thing doesn't mean you can't still be great at something.
exactly. Yeah.
And I like that. That's a great message, man. I'm really glad I got to talk to you. I know when Blue watches this later, he's gonna freak out and be like, "Oh my god, oh my god." So last thing, what are you working on next, that you can talk about, and where can people find more of your stuff?
So on social media, I mean, social media is this is kind of collapsing and rebuilding itself
For
as we
sure.
are recording this. So right now, you just look for Mike Chen writer at
Mhm.
any social media platform. Like, I had migrated to Threads, but now I'm migrating to Blue Sky. My Instagram is mostly photos of my dog.
Awesome.
Um, Jake, so my dog Jake,
Mhm.
as in Jake the dog from Adventure Time, Jake Sisko from Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and Jake Lockley from Moon
Awesome.
Knight.
Awesome.
He really is a little bit of all three of them. Um, so yeah, Mike Chen writer on all socials. I have coming up, I have an original space opera called The Photonic Effect that will come out in probably early 2026. We're in the editing stages of it right now. I have a top secret project that I want to tell everyone about because I'm very excited about
Don't do it.
what it is and where it's from. but I
Awesome.
can't just
Yeah, of
yet.
course.
I think it'll probably come out in a few months, or like the news of it will probably
The
come out
news.
in a few months.
Mhm.
And then my first YA book will come out in sometime in 2026, and it's called A Magical Science, and it's about a kid who got whisked away to a magical realm where he became like the hero who saved everything, but then
Mhm.
afterwards he came home and he's still a high schooler who's struggling with trigonometry, and how does he consolidate those two very strange lives that he has. Um, and so that has yet to be written. So that
For
was
sure.
sold on proposal. So I don't know if it'll be any good, but I hope it will be.
Awesome. So yeah, guys. So if you want to know what that top secret project is, follow Mike Chen Writer on the socials that we listed. I'll put a link down below, so please check him out. And Mike, thank you again so much for being here today, man. This again, I can't say how much it meant to us, but it has meant a lot. And I hope for the viewers and people who watch this, they go check out your book and read this and check out your other bodies of work. I'm telling you, Star Wars fans, read Brotherhood, read Vampire Weekend, check out Mike's stuff. The guy's amazing, and this book is top notch. My review will drop very soon. Mike, thank you again, sir.
Thank you for having me.
Anytime, man. Peace.